Damian on Design on the Lucy Ann Land Show, Ann Arbor's talk station, 1290 WLBY. You are back in town. It's nice to have you here.
Back in town, back from Africa. Yeah, it's good to be back.
You were in South Africa, your
homeland.
homeland.
South Africa, my homeland, for a few weeks. Got to spend a lot of time with the family, spent some time at the game reserve. Became acutely aware of the terrible rhino poaching problem that's going on, and the elephant tusk problem, but had a fabulous time.
Well, it's nice to have you back home.
Yeah, it's good to be home.
Even though you went home.
Yeah.
Today's show is the start of what is going to be really interesting concerning the Bentley Historical Library and its importance in our community. This is the campus archive for the University of Michigan, located on North Campus. It was established in 1935 by the regents of the University of Michigan, and it serves as the official archives of the university, and it documents the history of the state of Michigan and the activities of our people, organizations, and voluntary associations. It is
a resource, right?
Extreme importance.
Incredible. Yeah. Incredible what's been gathered here, and some of our early, one of our earlier shows with Grace Shackman, wonderful Ann Arborites who really introduced us in more depth to what's going on at the Bentley, and so we've got this series coming up, and also continue some of our work. People like Brian Conway from the state of Michigan, Emily Evans from Detroit. So it's a thrill to have Ted with us today.
And he is Professor Ted Ligibel, Director of Eastern Michigan University's Historic Preservation Programs. Nice to have you here, sir.
Thanks very much.
Glad to be here.
And you recently, this past January, you were reappointed to the State Historic Preservation. Is that right?
I was, yeah, to the State Historic Preservation Advisory Board. We're the group that reviews all of the National Register nominations that come into the state. And it's really interesting because it's right on topic with what we're talking about today in terms of the mid-century modern. How many 1950s, 1960s era buildings are coming before us for designation. You know, so it really is a sign of the times. In historic preservation right now, the mid-century stuff is one of the hottest topics. You know, when I got into this back in some other era,
an earlier decade,
a much earlier decade, we were just beginning to look at those things they call bungalows, you know, from the 19-teens and 20s, and there wasn't even widespread acceptance of those. So, my, how far it has come in just 40-some years.
Well, it's a sign of all of us getting older,
we all
too.
getting older.
Your program at Eastern Michigan University is renowned. Largest such program in the nation, I understand.
Yeah, isn't that something? It's a sort of a hidden gem, but we have anywhere between 80 and 90 graduate students and about 20 undergrads in the minor program. So that pretty far eclipses any of the other preservation programs in the country.
That is fantastic.
And we have a really, you know, we're really good with placement, just to toot our own horn a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
So I think that's part of it. You know, people know they're going to be well-trained. We're an applied program. You come in, you'll learn how to do all this stuff, and you're ready to go. You don't need any additional training. So
there's another Michigan institution that's placing countrywide?
Yep, absolutely. Worldwide.
Worldwide, okay.
Yeah. In fact, I just got an email from a student who's teaching cultural heritage in India.
Fantastic.
So, you know, it's really interesting to watch. We keep pretty close tabs on the alums.
The fact that you have such a great program at Eastern Michigan University, does that speak to this region then?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I think it's a long story of how it came to be, but we're the only one in the nation that is in the geography and geology department. Okay. And part of that is because we want our students to understand why things look the way they do. Okay. You know, why did people decide to settle here or settle there, and what did they do after they settled there? And we feel that's really important, understanding, you know, the architecture of a place or the very sense
planning,
of a place.
How it formed, how it shaped.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. So we teach both high-style architect design, architecture, and the vernacular side of it, which is just, you know, the carpenter was hired and he or she came in and built this property, or they built the barn. You know, how did that all happen, and who were the people that made it happen?
Well, when you have two such great programs, Eastern Michigan, University of Michigan, the Bentley Library, all within just a few miles of each other, makes it a powerhouse.
We're very happy bedfellows, to put it that way. The Bentley and our program are particularly close, and of course with Eastern Michigan University's archives, we have a special collection of historic preservation, which is also probably the biggest in the state. So we use the Bentley continually because they are such a wonderful resource for the whole state, but in particular, for this region.
How so, particularly with historic preservation?
Right.
Talk a little bit about that relationship.
Well, because they're holding, like you said, they go back to the 1930s. And even the Clements Library, which is another really fascinating place, isn't so much collecting modern material, but the depth of holdings there. And I have to say, too, the Ypsilanti Historical Society, the Washtenaw County Historical Society, we work very closely with all of them. I'm not sure people realize the extent of holdings of these institutions and how much information is really there about the...
Well, we certainly do, and I think that's partly why this urge on our part here to highlight this organization, because the holdings and the information is extraordinary.
Yeah, it is
the depth of it is just stunning.
Yeah, and we've been really fortunate. We have a great working relationship with them, and particularly over this mid-century modern stuff, they have been actively collecting, excuse me, they've been actively collecting the records of mid-century modern architects, many of whom, of course, were taught at U of M, and but also had careers on the side where they designed all these buildings. But they have papers of Robert Metcalf and David Osler and Tivadar Balog and Albert Kahn and Muschenheim and just a host of noted local luminaries, and some of whom also had international and national reputations. Gerganoff out of Ypsilanti, who designed the Washtenaw County current courthouse.
Okay.
So, they've been actively pursuing those records. Well, one of the neat things about this period of time for students is records are available. Right. When you're researching the 19th century and you're trying to find out when this Queen Anne home was built, and you can find the basics, but to go back and talk to the people who had it built,
someone literally had to write it
or
down.
the architect who designed it, that ain't happening. So, it's really a lot of fun and very useful for the students to have one-on-one. Robert Metcalf's still around.
Yeah.
David Osler's still around. So, we've had them at our presentations. And, it's kind of fun. They'll raise their hand and say, well, no, that's not exactly what we meant.
Well, I had in mind.
Dr. Ted Ligibel, Director of EMU's Historic Preservation Programs. Damian Farrell, local architect with Damian Farrell Design Group here in Ann Arbor, and his show, Damian on Design, on the Lucy Ann Land Show, 1290 WLBY. Describe what mid-century modern is, Dr. Ligibel.
Well, it's kind of hard to put a bracket around it, but it's really everything after the World War II on up into the 70s. It's really hard to put an end date on it. But as you probably know, during the 30s and 40s, a lot of the European architects, particularly the Germans, Mies van der Rohe and so on, came to the United States. Right. And set up practice here, and that really kind of pushed this country into a new look at architecture. And after the war, there was a sense that we survived. We've got to move on.
Yeah.
And so the 50s was all about moving on and lots of new architecture, and of course there were all these new families. So you had to have places to put them. So there was a huge building boom in the country, and there wasn't thought that, hey, let's look back at, the older styles.
No, this was a brave new time.
Revival or colonial. This is a brave new time. Let's move ahead. I can remember my grandmother, for example, painting every piece of natural furniture in the house white. It's like, let's get away from all that old woodsy stuff. It's going to be crisp and clean, and so that's kind of what happened. And Michigan, of course, was at the forefront of that. You look at places like Cranbrook, which, were internationally known with the Booths and the Saarinens and all the people that Carl Millis, the sculptor, all the people that came through there. This is a crucible of international design. And it's right here, just...
and all the furniture from the west side of the state.
All the furniture from the west side, Herman Miller, yeah.
I mean, designers,
it's remarkable. And that's one of the things that this program called Mid-Century Modern was trying to highlight around the world, was the role that Michigan played in this. Charles and Ray Ames, the great designers, were here.
I think a lot of people forget that.
They do.
They associate them very much with the California schools of design,
right.
The West Coast, but it all started here for them.
It did all start.
But what was it about that design that now has created this interest today, some 50 years later.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you go on eBay now and try to buy an Ames chair or something, and it's thousands and thousands. Right. I can remember, well, before eBay, but people put them out on their yard to get rid of them.
No, that's true.
It has really changed, and it's difficult to sort of, again, to answer that, although I think it's partially rooted in this whole idea that we've got to move ahead. We've got to change our look. We've got to change our thinking. We're in the 20th century now. We're out of the war. We're out of the Depression. Let's get on with making things look different. Now, that doesn't mean that, everything was torn down that was old. Of course, we know that isn't true, thank heavens. But now it's just long enough that the people are beginning to look back, and in the period of significance for historic buildings is 50 years. So, we're looking at 1964.
Right.
Excuse me. So we can't ignore all that stuff from the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s that was built. And so it's just really the preservation movement kind of coming full circle and recognizing that there are these newer resources that really need to be looked at and protected, because they're also being demolished at a pretty astonishing rate, as new developments occur. So a lot of things are being lost, and we thought actually back in the mid-90s, I was advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. That was really kind of funny. We recognized that this was an issue. There's a lot of mid-century stuff that was architect design that was really good was being destroyed. And no talk about it at all. So we as the advisors, we put on a whole session at one of the national conferences while the head of the National Trust was talking about the dangers of sprawl and modern architecture, and here's his group of advisors doing something exactly opposite. So it really begins sort of in the 90s when preservationists get reflective and they start thinking about that 50-year rule. And, things from the 70s, things from the 60s. And then it just blossomed. My students are probably as interested in something built in the 1950s as they are as something built in the 1870s. And it's, it's not that they're ignoring the 1870s, but there's this new interest, and it's very vital, and everybody's talking about it, and the people who did it might be still alive, or the original family still living in the building, or so it's a very exciting time.
And what's so interesting, Michigan seems to finally be getting on the map for it, getting credit for something they did a very long time ago.
Absolutely. Otherwise people think, oh, yeah, well, New York and L.A. Well, sorry.
From the heydays of Detroit, we've talked about this on the show a number of times, the power of design that came out of the automobile industry. I mean, there are ripple effects from that, and obviously Detroit's had its sad time, but now, what an exciting time here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you look at, for example, Albert Kahn, you're talking about. The impact he had on international industrial design was one of the biggest ever, if not the biggest ever. He was hired by Russia to come and design the whole hundreds of their factories. And he pioneered that whole, sort of clear story, sawtooth roof pattern. So, here we have a guy who is internationally important, but not necessarily recognized as that. And his records are all at the Bentley Library, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. In fact, one of our alums was involved early on in actually a class that I had where we went to the Kahn firm and documented all the drawings that they had. It was over 7,000 drawings that they had. And the firm was beginning to talk about what do we do with it. We went into this huge warehouse just full of drawings and specs and, all kinds of wonderful photographs.
We had Alan Cobb, who's the head of the Kahn firm now, on the show. And so we've had this really wonderful exposure and this ability to discuss at many different levels people like Kahn and their impact on this area, and digging into the history at Cranbrook. And then our own self-discovery here of what's going on at the Bentley. So it's been a wonderful layering of all of this stuff as we've talked about Michigan as a state of design.
When you look at Detroit and the remaking of Detroit, whether it's gentrification or just pulling that city back up out of the ruins, what is the story going to be architecturally 50 years from now for that city, particularly when you look at how they're trying to remake neighborhoods, trying to tear down blight?
Yeah.
What's that
Yeah.
going to be?
Well, I think, probably the jury's out on it, but I can see a couple of things happening, that there's probably a lot more concentrated neighborhoods. The structures that are going up now, some of them are, well, I guess, what we would call postmodern or neo-traditional. You've seen some of those along Woodward and so on. I'm not sure what the long-term future of places like that are, but I think what you're going to see is this clustering of neighborhoods that are sort of grouped together with perhaps even green spaces or transportation corridors in between. Ideally, the downtown will, continue to survive and thrive because it is the heart of that.
Have we lost a lot of really valuable stuff in Detroit,
Oh,
or do we still have stuff that will carry the history, if you will?
It's sort of an
the history.
interesting conundrum. Detroit was so big
Right.
and had so many incredible buildings. Yes, many, many have been lost, but there are still many there.
Yeah.
So partially it's just the result of having had so many. When you look at that city, it was twice as dense as it is now, maybe 3 times as dense. Because you drive out some of the mile roads and there's nothing left.
There's nothing left.
So, it was just totally packed. My wife's grandparents, great-grandparents, all lived there. And, just all next door to one another in these small neighborhoods that don't even exist anymore. So it's changing pretty rapidly, but I really think it's turned a corner, and I see tremendous amount of interest. One of our students just got hired, for example, as the development director for the fellow who bought the old Packard plant.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
It was a
Kahn
South
working with them
American.
too.
Yeah, and so he's
the firm is
really
working
serious
with them.
about making something happen.
He is.
Well, that was the great white elephant, literally. What in the
The
world are you
greatest,
going to...
other than the train station.
Other
perhaps,
than the
right?
train
Yeah.
station,
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
I mean, what do you do with this?
Yeah.
And it just takes people with vision.
And
to
he's
say-
done this before in other
Yeah.
countries,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I think
He knows what he's
He
doing.
does.
Yeah.
He really
He's-
does.
he's not
And I don't
right.
think he would invest in Detroit
Right.
if he didn't see, if he had a vision that something was going to happen there.
Dr. Ted Ligibel, Director of EMU's Historic Preservation Programs. He also serves on the Governor's Michigan Historic Preservation Review Board. As we sum up our conversation today for the launch of what is going to be this series concerning the Bentley and its importance concerning historic preservation, Designs on Michigan at the Bentley Historical Library. Some final thoughts, gentlemen.
Well, I guess I can't say enough about the Bentley, even though I'm from EMU. But EMU has a great archives too. But
Right.
the Bentley has been so good about collecting the local historical material, and
And I
now
think we have to give a quick shout out to Nancy
Nancy
Durramity,
Durramity,
I
yeah,
should say,
absolutely.
for her work in connecting us all and setting this up for us
Yeah.
as well. So interesting time ahead for us here as we start to investigate this. And I have one quick question for you, following on in Detroit.
Sure.
In your travels around pretty much the world in looking at how cities have preserved themselves in towns and so on, have you seen this kind of passion before for a city that we're seeing in Detroit, for its revitalization, for its ongoing, its ability to continue to live?
Oh yeah,
You have, okay.
Pittsburgh.
Okay.
It's a really good
So this is
example.
good.
Even Cleveland.
It can happen.
Oh, it can. It's cyclical.
Yeah.
It does happen.
Okay.
Even I'm from Toledo. Originally in
Yeah.
Michigan now, but I saw it in Toledo. So it's very cyclical. Obviously, it's very.
So this bodes well for our region.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I think it does.
Dr. Ligibel, what's the next mid-century modern? In other words, if you look at
Good
today's
question.
offerings from architects, what 50 years from now are we going to be talking about?
Yeah, well, if we're looking at the 50-year rule, everything that's built 50 years before, shopping malls and, postmodern neighborhoods and, commercial buildings that we may look at now and say, it's just a big ugly glass box. McDonald's, the first McDonald's ever built is already in the National Register.
Really?
Of Historic Places. Yeah, it's still there out in Downey, California.
Wow.
So,
And I think you're right on target on that, because when you think of shopping malls, and as much as I love Briarwood, they're trying to stay relevant to today. When you look at Arbor Hills Crossing and the types of shops that have cropped up there on
Right.
Washington, it's a different shopping experience that
Right.
people seem to want now. We're almost back to the outdoor stuff. Remember when
Yeah,
Arborland started as
yeah.
an outdoor shopping
Right,
experience?
sort of the Main Street of the old days,
That's
you know,
right.
that's what they're trying
That's
to
right.
recreate. which
In pockets
interesting.
around the city. It is interesting. So
Yeah.
I don't know what our shopping experience is going to be like 50 years from now. I hope we're not all doing
Mostly
it.
online.
I was going to say, I hope we're not all doing it online, but maybe.
Well, we'll get our packages by drones. You know.
Well, that's right.
That's what they're saying.
That's right. Maybe we'll finally recall what it was like to shop
Yes, right.
in the 21st century. Great talking with you
Thank you
today.
so much.
Thank you so
Oh,
Yeah, I
much.
really
thank you.
appreciate the time.
Thank
Dr.
you for
Ted
everything.
Ligibel from Eastern Michigan University, Damian Farrell from Damian Farrell Design Group. It's Damian on Design each Saturday on the Lucy Ann Lance Show, Ann Arbor's talk station, 1290 WLBY. Great job, gentlemen. Thank you. It was a really
Thank you so
interesting
much.
conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Did a
You
wonderful
know, like I
job,
said, I'm
so.
happy to chat about it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. It is
Yeah.
just a lot of fun.
It's just, the material is endless. It's
I think you'd be a
fabulous.
fun professor to have a class with. Very interesting.
Well, I believe it's got to be fun as well as education. You know, you got to do both.
Yeah.